Welcome to Storycomic Presents, where we interview amazing storytellers and artists. This is episode 165. I'm your host, Barney Smith of Storycomic.com, and we're excited to have back with us the internationally acclaimed cartoonist and educator, Marek Bennett. Marek!
Hey,
how you doing?
How are you?
It's really exciting. I think I've known you for about 3 years, and for the past 3 years, you've been working on volume 3 of the Civil War Diary of Freeman Colby. And something amazing just happened recently. You are now publishing the Civil War Diary of Freeman Colby volume 3.
Well, remember, before we started, I said that I'm doing this kind of experimentally. I'm technically, the amazing thing that happened is I kept working on it. Yeah, it's going to be a long publishing process.
Right.
Instead of waiting till I had everything totally done, I decided this is the month to do the Kickstarter, and I have all the page art done. Like, I have a proof right here that is the full story of the book.
Right.
And it's come out to be exactly the same length as volume 2, actually. So I'm just editing that. It was like, I realized, oh, this is 470 pages. Wait a minute. And I went and checked, and volume 2 is 470 pages. And I thought, that's a sign. Stop right there. So I kind of threw the Kickstarter together, even though, you know how, like, there's so many pieces of a book, like a table of contents, an intro, the afterword, the source material,
right?
Something called a cover, and where I had all that set up for volume 2 for that Kickstarter. So once the Kickstarter ended, I could send it to the printer, and go. Right. With this, I said in the Kickstarter, okay, we're doing this now because now's the anniversary of half the book takes place this week, right?
Oh, wow.
Right?
Okay.
In May, in 1864. And then, then everybody who's backed the Kickstarter gets to watch over the summer. I'll keep posting updates, and it'll be like, okay, here's a couple cover designs. Here's the final one. I don't know what we may vote on some stuff. It may just be surprise updates. But I thought, oh, that'll be really fun to have the backers more involved in that process so they get to see it, because maybe that's the teacher side of what I do. Like, I just love sharing the process of these projects. And you're right, it takes several years to put together that book.
Well, especially as you said, that's 470 some odd pages of art in script. And I'm really curious over the fact of putting on like my business hat to this. Is like was there ever an idea for you to split it in half and make a volume 3 250 some odd pages and then volume 4 200?
Away with your ideas. Yeah, the original idea, like volume 2, is January 1 to December 31, 1863.
Okay.
This is for folks that don't know the series. It started off, volume 1 is based on a Civil War diary that mostly takes place in 1862, and all the words come out of that diary.
Right.
And it actually ends in you got it there. It actually ends in April 1862. And volume 2 kind of cycles back and starts January 1st to December 31st, because, that's kind of a nice defining period for a book. And then my idea was that volume 3 would go maybe not right to the end of 1864, but up to the presidential election in November, because then volume 4 could go from that to all the loose ends leading into 1865 and the end of the war. If you know your Civil War history, right? It ends, the war per se, the official war kind of ends April, May 1865. And all the diaries and letters kind of peter out. The stories don't end. People's lives, if they're lucky, go on, and the stories continue.
Right.
But that was my initial plan. Oh, yeah, it'll be the full year 1864. But like I said, I got to 400 some pages, and I'm only in mid-May, and I realized, I have to redesign this project, and the breaking points it doesn't make sense to try to go to the end of the year and rush through things, because there's so much here and there's so many stories that to really do it justice, I need to just be present for these stories. And I'm at May 15th and the book is a little too long. And so now my editing begins and I trim it down to fit into a book form, you know?
Right. So yeah, that was going to be my second question for you. Is like, when you did a significant amount of research for this, and this was the other thing, is that, and I'm trying to recall the conversations we had, is that you didn't have enough of Freeman Colby's writing, so you actually added in some other letters and some other historical events that you were able to research to kind of give it a little bit more to fill in some of the gaps. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's one of the things I'm wrestling with in editing the book into shape. Like all the stories are drawn and they all make sense in their own right, but they all come from different people's accounts. And my job as the cartoonist now and as the book designer is to like get them in the right order and show them in the right context to each other, so that when you read through the book, it kind of flows from one story to another and you know who the characters are who are experiencing these stories. Like those that you're just paging through there, if you go up a little bit, the like in the letters that Freeman Colby writes home, I have one letter from this month of May that he wrote home. And it's basically because he was in combat for 2 weeks straight, 15 days straight, running through the woods, sleeping in the woods, dodging forest fires. He's not writing daily emails home. So he writes one letter and he's like, hey folks, I'm still alive. And here's one thing that happened each day, so I have these little anchor points to his story. And my original plan was to just stick to that text and have lots of space around those stories and like mystery space where we don't know what happens. It would feel more like an Edward Gorey story or something, where something happens and you're not sure why, and then suddenly something else happens and you have to figure out the connections. It would feel a little more like that. Yeah, he even says there in that letter, that's a panel from his April 28th letter. This is my only chance to write to dear parents, as all communication is prohibited from the front. So he knows he can't write lots of letters, right? So some of those panels you scrolled through come from a major of a Maine regiment who was there on the line right next to them, who wrote a detailed account of what happened on May 10th and 11th. So I could draw that from that point of view, and I draw it from Freeman Colby's point of view because he was there. And we'll never know exactly what these things looked like. Nobody was, walking around with a camera recording it. And even
so how
about like the war in Ukraine, you watch a couple of video clips, you still don't know exactly what happened, right? you see these little fragments of it. But my Walt Whitman quote as my motto is like the real war, the real soldier, the real war will never be written in books. And my corollary is like, so let's try drawing it, use the words to get into images that can capture something of the sense of the story.
So let me ask you, as someone who's putting this together and where you're kind of filling in the gaps by, as you said, looking at historically what was happening during that time, do you feel as though when you have to fill in the gaps with other pieces of information of historical reference, do you lose a bit of that intimacy of telling Freeman Colby's story at those points?
That you can possibly, but I think on the other hand, you also have an opportunity to get to know these characters much more deeply. When I'm teaching comics and defining comics, one of my favorite demonstrations is I'll draw like a stick figure with an ice cream cone, and then I'll draw a stick figure with an ice cream on the ground, and their face is smiling in the first one, they're frowning in the second. Maybe I should just draw this for you. Do you want to timestamp it and I'll share and draw it for you?
No, don't worry about that, because I have a lot of audio listeners anyway. So
yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So I'll draw like a figure with an ice cream cone, and then in another panel, a figure with ice cream on the ground. And what's the story? Oh, they dropped their ice cream or something like that, right? And I think, yes, there's the idea of putting images in sequence that are comics, one after another creates a story. But I think the next level in is I didn't draw the ice cream being dropped. I drew the before and the after, and then the reader puts it together. And because you imagine that action, I always tell people, because you imagine that action and I don't show it to you, you experience it on a deeper level. Like, you make it happen rather than me saying, this person dropped their ice cream, right? And if I drew it as a 3-panel comic and you saw the ice cream dropping, it might feel a little clumsy or a little overstated, right? Less is more. So I think it's kind of the nature of stories, that stories, yes, we add in details and we tell things, we tell stories, but just as important is that we leave things out. Because if you ask me, how was your day? And I said, well, my left eye opened first, and, and went in great detail every moment of my day, we'd be here till tomorrow. So storytelling requires us to take things out. And sometimes those things we take out are at the heart of the story, or are really central to them. Especially when you're writing letters home to your younger sisters from a battle zone, maybe. Right. So I can't go just on his text. That was the lesson of this project. I can't just trust my main storyteller and just go directly from his text. In order to get the story, in order to figure out what's going on, I have to go to other people who are looking for other angles and have different perspectives and can add pieces into this.
Right.
If that makes sense.
Talk to us on I'm also very curious about, as you brought that up, is the editing process. Now, is this something that you give to beta readers to do, or is this something that's intimate to you, that you self-edit out parts that you've already drawn, as you say, or already did, to kind of narrow down the story?
Yeah, I do a lot of, the nature of making comics is reiterative self-editing constantly. And actually the challenge is not to do that too much, otherwise you never finish a page. I have some sections of this book I must have redrawn 5, 6, 7 times, to the point where I started to wonder, oh no, am I getting a little compulsive about this? It's been 3 or 4 months. I'm circling back, I'm redrawing it, and then I find a redraw in my files that's the same approach to the story. So I have to tell myself, it doesn't have to be perfect, as you can see from my artwork. It doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be clear. And we'll circle back and we'll look over the book again in a month or two, or at the end. And if you still don't like it, we'll figure it out then. And then once I get things sort of into shape, I print up mini comics. I've been doing these little 1-sheet minis, like this one, through my Patreon, that I can print up 8 pages on a sheet, and I can print up the source image that I used for that story on the other side. That's a Winslow Homer engraving from Harper's Weekly, and it's what I used for the 2-page spread in this story. And it's a little tiny piece of that from that same section, the Major Small and his account of the charge at Spotsylvania Courthouse. And then I go to schools, and when I visit and I'm teaching a school group, I make sure I hand out these minis, and they get to read them, and I tell them, please give me some feedback and let me know, either in person or through my website. And I get good feedback from teachers and sometimes from students too, and families.
Do you, so for volume 3, as the narration and the story kind of gets more expansive, and there's different actors coming into this, did you, based off of the style that you're doing specifically for Freeman Colby, did you have to learn how to draw new objects or outfits or anything like that had to fit within your style?
Yeah, constantly, because I used a lot of primary source materials, even more in this one than usual. For instance, that one, if you go up one panel there, that's a little panel from the story of Wilbur Fisk. And he's a guy I met because I had these gaps in Freeman Colby's story, and I went looking for writers who had written letters from these places at these times. And this is a photograph of Wilbur Fisk of the 2nd Vermont and his collected letters, Hard Marching Every Day, which edited by Emil and Ruth Rosenblatt. And it's an amazing collection. He wrote all these letters back to, coincidentally, the newspaper was called the Green Mountain Freeman, which is just a neat little connection to Freeman Colby by name. But he was writing to this Rutland, Vermont newspaper, and he wrote these wonderful accounts. And in some of them, he kind of lectures and harangues and motivates and gives these wonderful abolitionist speeches and sermons, really. And that panel comes from a space. I frame it as he's around the campfire. It's a letter he wrote just before the Battle of the Wilderness. So he's kind of trying to put the war into perspective. Why are we fighting this war? And he writes this letter to his people back in his home state of Vermont. So I pull that text out of that letter and then show him around the campfire trying that sermon out on all these other guys in the Army of the Potomac. And I just happen to have Freeman Colby and his friend walk past as he's giving this sermon, because they were there in the camps. They were out walking around. That's what the guys did when they had a little free time in the evening. If they could, they would go out and walk around and find an interesting sight or see people in other regiments. So I take a little liberty with that. I don't know if Freeman Colby went walking around after dinner on the night of May 4th, 1864. We'll never know exactly what he did. He could have been checking his gear or just sleeping from marching 20 miles that day. Right. But I have a whole bunch of accounts of people who did go walking around and talked with each other and hung out together and smoked pipes together, not knowing what was about to happen the next morning. And I thought, well, this would be a great place for Wilbur Fisk to step out and sort of give the speech that he was actually thinking and writing at the time. So it's sort of I think of it as fiction in the sense of I'm composing these panels with my characters, and I don't know if the rows of tents looked exactly like that against the pine trees of the wilderness, but that's the fiction of it. But the nonfiction part is these are actual words that the people these characters are based on said to each other at the time, and felt, and actual things that they expressed. And I think the interesting thing when you draw that out, when you read the letter, it's a stark sermon of what the war means to Wilbur Fisk. He says, there never before was a rebellion like this one. In most rebellions, the people rebel against the few, the many against the few, and they expand their rights. But in this rebellion, the few, the slaveholders, have rebelled against the people. And this is the people's government, and the few have rebelled against it. The slaveholder has rebelled against it. That's why we're fighting this war, for the people's government. And as I'm working on this, it was January 6th, 2021. And I did a school group that midday. And then I kind of looked up from that after we had been drawing comics together and having a great time. I checked my news, and January 6th is going on. And I realized, oh my gosh, this sermon that Wilbur Fisk wrote in the middle of the Civil War suddenly has a different meaning to me. And as I draw it, so I'm working in the imagery of the Capitol building, which had just been completed in Washington, D.C. in that just a few months previously. I'm working in his text and the imagery of the Civil War around it. And one thing that he doesn't even mention in that whole sermon of why slavery must be, this dragon confederacy must be, rooted out and destroyed utterly. He doesn't really mention anything other than the politics of it. He doesn't mention the people that affects, and the people who have been enslaved for generations in that system, because he's focused on the politics in his letter. But as I draw it, I get to work in, there were a lot of, for instance, fugitives from slavery who had joined the Union Army and were helping out around camp. they show up, if not in the regimental histories, they show up in the photographs. So from those photographs, I could work them into the scene, and then they can sort of come into it as he's making his points. They're in the image also, and then because they're in the image, they get to tell their stories too. So it's a lot of research to like pull these stories that fit together. But when you find the stories that fit together, they kind of fall into place like puzzle pieces, and
Right.
the whole scene suddenly makes sense. It just doesn't make sense to talk about the politics of slavery without also talking about the people who have been enslaved and whose families have been directly affected by those political forces, right? And that's something that's missing from like the military history or the letters that Freeman Colby was writing home. He's not getting into that. So
Right.
those are all the different perspectives that deepen it for me. And then when they go charging up that hill and it's, a big scene of chaos and havoc, where some of those people are coming from and why they're there and why they're able to do what they do.
So let me ask you then this, is like, at what point do you freely feel fine with putting in some artistic license, and how much of the stuff that you do is you put in this book and saying, this is sacrosanct, I'm not going to make up this particular part of something?
My rule is if somebody says something, I'm going to show them saying it, or writing it. I'm not going to, I might change the wording, but I'm going to keep the sense of what they do. In volume 1, I wouldn't change anything. And if I changed the punctuation a little, I'd put a little mark under each panel.
Oh, right. Yeah. I remember
so
that, yeah.
When you read that book, you're getting literally what Freeman Colby put down. But my test here in volume 2, and even more so in volume 3, is if I feel like if I leave something out, it's not going to be true to the bigger picture. Because everybody, when we, like I said, storytelling is as much taking out as putting in details. And what happens with a lot of these stories, you read like Shelby Foote's multi-volume, The Civil War, a narrative, right? It's thousands of pages, and it's this novelistic treatment of the Civil War. Almost no mention of slavery, almost no mention of the African-American units in the Union Army. A couple mentions here and there, but really that's not his focus. He's a Southern historian, and he focuses on the Southern armies, and it really gives you. We all create biased histories. We all have a point of view, right? But it really gives you a view of the war that's very much oriented to military maneuvers and big units and orders by generals. And that's not enough for me. That's been done, and I'm not interested in that. And if I'm going to be right alongside Freeman Colby in a day-to-day reconstruction of what life was like, if not exactly for Freeman Colby, then for the people around him, a composite. It's really a composite picture. And if I'm doing that and I find a little clue that points in another direction, that opens a door onto a much bigger room that has many more stories in it, I'm going to go through that door and at least hint at it, at least build it into the story somehow. I give you an example. There's a casual mention in his regimental history on January 28th, 1864. There's just a couple sentences in the regimental history. It says, we crossed over the river into enemy territory, did a little patrol, and we came back. And it was interesting marching around in rebel territory. No mention of like what they saw or what they found. And I originally drew that. Oh no, you know what they did see? They could see that rebel units were being replaced with new troops. And they thought, well, they probably think they're all going to desert and come over to us because we're the only ones with food around here. They're all out of food. And that, ha, ha, ha. And then they march back to their camps with that intelligence. And one of the artists I'm using to figure out what this looked like, there were several artists right on the scene in that time, in that place in Virginia. And so there are actually drawings of people on picket and the countryside, and then patrols marching. And I went into the Harper's Weekly, or right around that time, a couple weeks later, because of course there's a couple week lag for these drawings. Whatever would happen at the end of January is going to come out in the late February edition. And in the late February edition, there's this picture of all these people who have escaped from slavery, who are riding horses, who are riding wagons, who are coming down the road. It's an amazing picture. It's very dark. It's hard to see, but there are whole groups of African-American families who are coming down the road, escaping from slavery. And there's a little article that goes with that picture by the artist who was there. And he says, oh, there's some interesting scenes from what just happened when I went out on a patrol into rebel territory. And, you know, this sort of thing, this is typical for what happens on patrols in every part of the country constantly. So, and then he proceeds to tell these stories of how people like took their master's horse, saddled it up, put the whole family on it, and ran for the Union Army once they saw them. And the Union troops are like, where are all you coming from? How are you ready to run at a moment's notice? And the people who were escaping told them, oh, we knew you were coming for hours. And they're like, but we're an army patrol. We're like, you know, marching through the countryside. They're not supposed to know we're coming. Oh, we knew you were coming for hours. How the word had gotten through the countryside. And the moment the Union Army showed up, slavery dissolved. Their enslavement ended, and they like threw down their hoes and threw down their tools. They were working in the fields, and they had their bags, and they grabbed their kids, and they put the old people on horses. And suddenly there's like hundreds of people, you know, joining this patrol. And there's no mention of that at all in Freeman Colby's units.
Wow.
You know, but it's possible they didn't encounter that, right? It's possible they just went out, marched around, and then came back and nothing happened. Never know for sure. It's possible they were like Alfred Lowe, the artist, says, this is typical of patrols that happen constantly throughout the countryside. So I'm more inclined to think they probably didn't write that into the official report, right? The official report was the military maneuver. So I have to choose, like, okay, they didn't mention it. Do I stick with the fact that they left any mention of that out in this regimental history that's not about the dissolving of slavery? Or do I go with the primary source of the time where this artist, whose work I'm using to know what the stuff looks like, said this happens all the time in every patrol? Right. I'm going to go with that because that's a bigger story. That's a bigger sense of what's happening in January 1864 and what the war is about. And if I left that out, then the reader would have no sense that that was going on. So that's what I mean by I go through the door and I'm like, I'm going to grab what I can story-wise and weave it into whatever little pieces I already have. And it really, then we're all looking through that door. We can all see that big story space there.
So do you, what's your opinion when people label your books as history, or do you grab that title, or do you say, well, it's not exact, or how do you, do you consider these like full on like textbook versions of history? Or
I called volume 1 nonfiction. Okay. And I think in the BISAC codes, I do call it nonfiction because it's more nonfiction than fiction. If all the text is direct quotes from primary sources and half the panels are direct quotes from primary artwork, you know, it would be deceptive to say, oh no, it's a dramatization, because it's not. They're not made up characters. The fact that maybe one was a few rivers over or the next state over in one case, you know, that's the creative side of it, but it's creative nonfiction to me. I prefer to say like a graphic novel drawn from primary sources. And then when people, and that's, you know, if you tell people, oh, it's nonfiction, half the readers, especially at like a comics convention or something, are like, oh, okay. Are the bathrooms back there? You know, not that. Like I learned early on in teaching the surest way to kill a summer program is to be like, hey kids, history, comics. Nobody signs up for it. But if you're like comics camp based on, you know, a diary from the Civil War. That camp fills up just because it's the same material, it's the same approach, but it's different branding. So it is an important question, I guess. But I think the title itself, the Civil War Diary, if you're interested in the history and you come into that from that angle and you pick it up, I want you to immediately see, like in the introduction or in the first pages, hey, this is drawn all from diaries and letters that actual people actually wrote about their actual events, if you believe them. And then when you get to the end, I want to be upfront about the little fictions I made. Like there's this nurse, Sarah Lowe, who when Freeman Colby's too sick to tell his story, well, he's in bed in the hospital for months and he doesn't really, I don't have many of his letters from that period. So yeah, there she is. So Sarah Lowe, she wrote a letter every night. I don't know how she did it, caring for hundreds of patients in multiple wards. And then she sits down every night and writes like a 20-page letter to her aunt. It's incredible. And the New Hampshire Historical Society has so many of those letters perfectly preserved. You can go check them out in their reading room, hold them in your hands, flip through them. Some of them I swear, are bloodstained. They're powerful documents. So instead of Freeman Colby, instead of just, silence as he sits too sick to write a letter in his hospital bed, well, I pull her in and she can tell about what nursing is like and how she's caring for her patients who are too sick to write letters. So she has to write them for them and so on. And then when he's better, he actually starts writing letters for other patients. And she's recruiting teachers. So I draw him as a teacher getting involved to teach the men how to read and stuff. And at the end of the book, you'll see, she's at Armory Square Hospital. He's at Carver Hospital. Their paths, I don't think, ever crossed, except she visited Carver Hospital once. But, they're in different hospitals, but they're fulfilling the same roles. And in the book, I just sort of put those hospitals together. It's a composite. And then the teachers that she recruited, well, that's Freeman Colby, the character, stands in for that. And the nurses that helped him, well, she stands in for that. And I'm upfront about those fictions at the back of the book. So you come away from the book, I hope, knowing, okay, here's the nonfiction parts, and here's the little bits of creative fiction that are introduced in. I mean, ultimately, I always say, like, comics are pure fiction. You're not looking at a person in front of you when you're reading about these characters. They're not actually there on the page. It's pure fiction. So I think it's okay to do that if I'm upfront with the readers about it.
So what one story did you see from either Sarah Lowe or Freeman Colby? What one story did you get that just kind of like gave you kind of like that aha moment, that shock? Like I really see that. That is something that I felt like I was there as you read that.
I feel like, I think I have to feel that way to draw the scene, to draw any of the scenes.
Okay.
There's one Sarah Lowe story. I just drew this. It just happened. I feel like it just happened. It happened on April 30th, 1864. And on April 30th last week, on April 30th, I kind of pulled out that letter and I was like, I haven't drawn this story yet. All right, let's work on it today and really get into this and think about this story. And she tells about how she was going around the wards checking on patients, and one patient seemed a little sick. He needed something for his throat that was inflamed, but they couldn't find a doctor. And you can just see, like, something's going to happen here. They couldn't find a doctor. Everybody's busy. One doctor says he'll check on him later. She goes and has tea. She thinks it's taken care of. Then she happens back through the ward later, and the guy's like not able to breathe. He's in his bed, passing out, not able to breathe. And she realizes he hasn't been treated, and she takes that so hard. And it's this frantic scene of her, and they finally get a doctor to come. They have to basically improvise a tracheotomy without the right tools. And she's there she says at the end, it's the most overpowering thing that's happened to her yet in her career as a Civil War nurse, which is saying something. I think partly because she took it so personally that she kind of felt like she should have done something earlier or made something happen earlier. So, I mean, in order to draw that scene, you can't draw that scene if you're not empathizing with all the characters involved. The frantic doctors, the patient who's struggling to live and just about dying, and this nurse who's telling the story, who's right there, who has her hands with the sponges covered in blood as they're trying to save this patient. And I found, I was in editing and going through the panels, I found there were certain panels where I wanted to focus on the patient and maybe his facial expressions. What did the patient look like? She doesn't describe him, of course. You don't get into a description of what the patient looks like when you're telling this dramatic scene. Right. Although it's interesting, she gives the patient's name. And if you go into the archives in the Historical Society, she collected photos that her patients gave her and her fellow nurses gave her. So sometimes you can go through those photos and on the back, there'll be a name written and you compare them with some of the stories and be like, awesome. Found you,
Wow.
And there's some amazing photos in that collection. But I haven't done that with this patient. It's possible we could figure out what they look like, but it's not important to the story. So, so your question, like, how does that affect me? I'm like, I don't know what the scene exactly looked like, but in my drawing of it, I have to sort of put myself into all these characters and figure out whose face do we need to see? What actions do we need to see at any given moment in the story? And then I kind of play with that and edit it and change the panels a lot. And hopefully it's done. I may go back and edit it some more.
So let's talk a bit about your pledge levels. You got some pretty fun pledge levels here, and as we say, you are a consummate educator, and I love the fact that you've put in here. You have your $10 pledge level for your ebook. You got the $20, which is kind of like the bread and butter one where you get the paperback. For $30, you're able to get a print book signed and sketched. So do you draw inside of it? Is that?
Yeah. I did that with volume 2. Also, I think I told people, if you have a character or a Civil War, celebrity person that you want me to draw, let me know. Otherwise, I'll just pick somebody from the story. And then there's a page at the beginning of the book. And then I think I did them as colored pencil sketches. So they're little stick figure vignettes of the characters under a tree or marching or doing something. Those are a lot of fun to do because, you just get a stack of books and think about the backer. If I know them or if I don't know them, I'll sort of pick a character and work it into the title page in some way.
And then you get the $32 pledge. So that's actually a really good deal. That's basically $16 per book for 2 signed copies.
Oof. Yeah, I mean, the Kickstarter, the way I think of it, the Kickstarter is just raising money to print the book, right? I'm not trying to make a living through the Kickstarter because that's, I've been working 3 years on this book,
right?
to try to fund your lavish cartoonist lifestyle for 3 years by doing a Kickstarter. It's not. I cut the prices. The final prices for these books tend to be like $20, $24, something like that, just because of retail. So I figure, well, I'll cut a little bit off. And if you want to order 2, this is the time to do it. Share it with a friend. I'm so glad that people can, as long as I'm not losing money on it, I'm so glad to be getting these out to new readers.
Right. And that's true. Because then if you look at, for instance, you have your, and you do get your print book plus free books for schools, which I think is amazing. So you're able to get a book for yourself and also get one for a teacher or a library. Mm-hmm. And then I love the fact that you have the complete set so far, volumes 1 through 3. You have 7 backers on this. That means you have 7 new readers.
Oh yeah. Right. Who haven't had the full set so far. Yeah. I'm
Yeah.
looking forward to seeing the three together. I mean, ultimately there's this isn't the final book in the series, 1864, May 1864. It's not the end of the story. But
Right.
it's just so satisfying to see them together. And I've been going back to both volume 1 and volume 2 and reading through them. I guess it's because as I edit the beginning of volume 3, I've got to like go back and get my speed up and read through volume 2. So I hit volume 3 and I feel like how it needs to start, and that's kind of fun to go back and see.
And so you have also for $200, someone's able to get one of the original pages
Yeah.
as the artwork.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
And some of them are kind of I'm not sure how I'll do it exactly. Some of them are like 2 or 3 pages with variant panels that then I assembled to make the final page. I'll probably make a couple of those available for people who like process, and then a couple finished pages.
Right.
Yeah, I'll just pick a selection and maybe give people first come, first serve, picks of what they're interested in.
And so talk to us a bit about your $300 pledge level, the Civil War cartooning session.
Oh, that I was thinking that would be kind of fun to do. Like that's what I do when I go to libraries or go in and visit school groups is I'll go in and if they're studying the Civil War, great. I can show them. Lately, I've been showing the page I'm working on that day, and then helping them build their own pages on their own topics using their own sources.
Right.
In this case, it's a 5-book set. It goes out to you. You can share them around with friends, and then we'll schedule a time to all get together on Zoom or Google Meets or something, and whatever you're interested in. We could look at a specific scene or something from the book, or we could draw something else that you want to do, or we could all work together to draw a single letter if everybody took a page, and drew a part of it. I'll check in with you beforehand and we'll see what you want to do. Or it could just be a how-to thing where, I show you a couple of characters and then we build a scene and take suggestions from everybody, and maybe they all go together as one long panorama or something in the end.
Right.
We'll have fun with it.
This is great. And like Marek, once again, congratulations for hitting your goal. And you already have 67 backers. You still, as of this recording, you got about 3 weeks left on it. So that's exciting. That's really exciting.
We've got some stretch goals coming up. We're almost past the first one. I have to post them soon. But like with volume 2, I did a bunch of things with volume 2 that I really liked. Volume 2 has some maps in it, but the backer copies in the end, there was a fold out map at the back that I could insert and paste into the back. So then you fold out a big map on nice parchment paper. And I was really glad we could do that. So that's like one of our first stretch goals.
Right.
There's a couple things like that since we've got the month, I want to keep putting materials out there so that people can share, and getting the word out and just reach as many readers as we can with this. So thank you for hosting this and showcasing it.
It's great. And I got to say too, as somebody who's also a fan of your Patreon page, I highly recommend folks to definitely check out Marek's Patreon. You get some really nice stuff on here based off of, the posts and then you also just to be able to see stuff as it goes, I think is really fun. So for those that are fans of Marek's work and those that are fans of just learning more about comics in general, I can't think of a better place to follow along than joining Marek's Patreon page. So
thank you.
Yeah.
It's a lot of work, but it's worth it. I've been getting some really good feedback, and actually people have really helped me make the book better and make all the projects better through their comments and feedback. So thank you.
Yeah, and no moss growing on you as a Rolling Stone, because you did the part of the Turner family stories. You also worked on the Most Costly Journey over the
Mhm.
last couple of years as well, and plus, plenty of workshops, virtual workshops. Uh, you're staying busy, Marek.
Oh, I know. But
Yeah.
I always say I'd rather be overwhelmed than underwhelmed. So
Right. Yeah.
so I just keep drinking from the fire hose, and it's been really fun.
Yeah.
But
Perfect.
it's just I really feel intense gratitude to be able to do this work, and to work with the people I get to work with, both past and present and future.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Marek, for coming on, and I'm really excited to see Volume 3 come out.
So am I. Yeah, we'll be in touch. I'll keep you posted.
Perfect. All right.
Nice to talk with you, Barney.
Yeah. No. Do you? Let me timestamp this again. God, I love timestamping. My goodness. So this is a discovery I just had, recently. Like, so I don't have to watch the whole thing and just kind of figure out where my ums and pauses are. Then I just do it as we do it, Marek. This is the best
Right.
part.
Well, the other option is every time you make an or a pause, you just wave your arms or jump around. And then as you're watching fast forward, you'll see those moments.
That's a good idea too.
You have to be sure to get them all.
Because that'd be just me just waving my arms back and forth. They're like, what's going on here?
Followers, yeah.
So